Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are strapping on our historical helmets, but instead of looking west toward Rome or Athens like we often do, we are turning our gaze sharply east. We're focusing on the colossal, really era-defining reality of the ancient Persian Empire, the Achaemenid dynasty.
Right.
Our mission today is pretty straightforward, but maybe academically radical. We want to fully deconstruct and challenge one of the most enduring, blood-soaked narratives of Western history. You know the one. The one enshrined in popular culture by the Battle of Thermopylae.
Yeah, that narrative. And for millennia, it's been told almost exclusively through the triumphant eyes of the Greeks. But that lens, well, it's not just incredibly narrow, it's fundamentally biased, isn't it?
Totally.
So we're here today to conduct a kind of forensic examination, seeking what scholars now call the Persian version, an understanding grounded not in Athenian myth-making, but in indigenous sources. That allows us to grasp the sheer scale, the complexity, and honestly, the administrative genius of this ancient superpower.
And we have a fantastic stack of sources to achieve this goal. We've pulled from modern academic research, essays that challenge the traditional military history, and I think most importantly, key excerpts drawn directly from this wealth of newly available indigenous Persian sources.
Right, the stuff we couldn't really read before.
Exactly. Cuneiform tablets from the imperial archives, royal inscriptions, local Babylonian and Egyptian texts. These are the materials that were simply unavailable or, unreadable until relatively recently.
And these indigenous materials, they provide a stark, really undeniable contrast to the Greek literature, which was often deeply biased and, let's be honest, intent on character assassination.
Okay.
So our specific goal here is to take Thermopylae, this battle enshrined in the West as the ultimate symbol of heroic sacrifice, the birth of Western liberty, all that, and re-examine it. But from the perspective of Xerxes and his command.
What happens then?
What happens when we view that famous stand not as some kind of miraculous defense, but as what it truly was for the Persians, which was a necessary, resounding, and strategically calculated victory.
Okay. We'll see, I think, that the narrative of Greek freedom was actually built on the foundation of a successful Persian military campaign.
Okay, let's unpack the initial problem then. We are talking about an empire that stretched from Libya and Egypt, across Anatolia, through Mesopotamia, all the way to India. I mean, it was a world-dominating entity. It defined the geopolitical landscape for over 2 centuries.
Huge.
Yeah.
Absolutely huge.
So why has Achaemenid Persia traditionally been relegated to this role, like a two-dimensional villain in our history books? Why hasn't it received the proper, the warranted place that its sheer scale demands?
Well, it comes down to a really foundational issue of historical inheritance, and it extends far beyond antiquity, actually.
How so?
Our historical narrative, our sort of common sense of where civilization comes from, it has been overwhelmingly molded around ancient Greek accounts. The sheer scale of the Persian Empire, its wealth, its endless manpower, its sophisticated administrative structure, it exerted what the sources call a remarkable hold over the Greek imagination.
Obsession, almost. You could say that. And this resulted not in objective history, but in a narrative rooted in what's called imperialized Philhellenism. Basically, the Greeks, particularly the Athenians, created a convenient monolithic image of the Persians. And that image just became history for centuries.
So what were the building blocks of that convenient image? It sounds like they created this sort of endless catalog of defining Persianisms that solidified the concept of the other.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Greek literature, art, drama, they generated this repetitive inventory of stereotypes. And they were meant to shock, and define the enemy as fundamentally un-Greek.
Like what specifically?
The Persians were portrayed as, effeminate, pampered despots, living lives of decadent, excessive luxury. Think about the descriptive detail you get. They wore expensive silk and dyed linen, used solid gold tableware, reclined on ivory furniture, consumed exotic, imported, fine food.
Right, all designed to show kind of moral weakness.
Precisely. Antithetical to the frugal, muscular Greek citizen ideal. That was the point.
And this luxury was always paired with sheer barbarity, right? That seems key.
Always. The caricature wasn't complete without contrasting the luxury with cruelty. So you get stories of impaling, crucifixion, drawing, and quartering, other hideous, drawn-out forms of torture. They were designed to be the converse of the Greeks, irrational, soft, but also dangerously cruel.
This is a crucial point, I think, for understanding Athenian democracy itself. Athenian society, especially during the classical age, wasn't just defining itself in a vacuum. It was essentially crafting its self-identity as a mirror image to Persian civilization.
That's it, exactly.
We are free citizens, they are slaves under a despot, we are rational, they are decadent, that kind of thing.
That is the crucial insight, yes. By positioning the Persians as the ultimate opposite other, Athens justified its own unique political and social model. It's how they define themselves against Persia.
Even Herodotus, our main source.
Even Herodotus. And remember, he was technically a Persian subject himself, from Halicarnassus. But he still fundamentally used the Persians as the antithesis of Greek rationality and freedom throughout his histories. Now, his work sometimes contains fragments of genuine Persian information, little nuggets, but you have to carefully extract them from the overall rhetorical framework he's built. It takes work.
And this narrative framework, it created a deeply damaging legacy, didn't it?
Yeah.
Particularly when European intellectuals rediscovered classical Greece during the Enlightenment, they were looking for the origins of their own perceived superiority.
Oh, absolutely. The theory that emerged then was radical and incredibly enduring. The idea was that European superiority derived directly from ancient Greece, the supposed birthplace of freedom and rationality.
Right.
And by extension, this required the Persian Empire to be positioned as the worst and most threatening of all barbarians.
Oh.
Why? Because their attempt at world domination was seen as an existential threat to this nascent, precious seed of Western liberty. This whole struggle was elevated to mythic status.
You can see how powerful and skewed the resulting conclusion becomes then. I mean, consider the British philosopher and political economist John Stuart Mill. He's writing in 1867, right at the height of the British Empire.
Yeah.
And he claimed, apparently without irony, that the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE was more important than the Battle of Hastings, even for British history. Just think about that intellectual audacity. A battle fought thousands of miles away, centuries before Britain was even a recognizable political entity, being deemed more crucial than a defining moment in their own national chronology. It's kind of staggering.
It is staggering, and Mill's quote perfectly illustrates how completely entrenched the Hellenocentric view became in shaping modern national histories and, frankly, imperial self-justification. Hermann Bengtson, who was an eminent German scholar of the Greco-Roman world, he perfectly encapsulated this view. He asserted that the Greek triumph against Persia, quote, charted the political and cultural development of the West. He claimed, and I'm quoting here, with the triumphant struggle for liberty by the Greeks, Europe was first born, both as a concept and as a reality.
Wow. That struggle against the Persian other literally became the entire ideological foundation upon which the West was built, according to that view. Okay, so if we leave that powerful, but as we're saying, flawed mythology behind for a minute and transition into the cold, hard mechanics of how this empire actually ran, the sheer scale of Persian sophistication becomes, well, undeniable. They weren't just chaotic forces of barbarism. They were, maybe above all, master administrators.
Oh, they absolutely were master bureaucrats. And this transition from myth to mechanics is where our indigenous sources really sing. They come alive.
Right.
The Achaemenids instituted this sophisticated, fact-based administrative system, and it was built on a core philosophical concept, Daida.
Daida. Okay, what does that translate to, roughly?
It translates roughly to law or perhaps divine commandment.
Okay, so how does that work in practice? If Daida is the law, what's its central requirement for the, millions of people under Persian rule?
Right, so Daida was the overarching legal framework, yes, but its central mandate was the requirement of loyalty, or arda, to the monarch. Arda meant truth and right order. It was essentially the moral foundation of the empire.
Okay.
Darius I, he explicitly conceived of himself as a defender of this cosmic law and justice. He believed he was invested directly by the supreme god Ahura Mazda to fight against the Drauga, which is the lie, or chaos.
The lie.
Yeah. And in doing so, he acted as a fair judge, consciously incorporating ancient legal traditions, like the much older codes of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia and Egyptian law, folding them into his imperial structure. He wasn't just inventing things whole cloth.
And the power of that concept, Daida, is reflected in its linguistic adoption across the vast territory, right? It wasn't just a Persian word.
It wasn't. The term Daida was borrowed widely. You see it as Datu Shashari, the law of the king, in Babylonian texts, and it appears frequently in the Hebrew Bible, too. This confirms its central, recognized importance as the hallmark of Achaemenid civic order throughout the empire. People knew what it meant.
This kind of comprehensive legal and administrative philosophy, it suggests an empire that was absolutely obsessed with the mundane details of record keeping. The sources say they reveled in administrative red tape. Is that fair?
Oh, I think that's absolutely fair. They reveled in it. And this is where the treasure trove of the Persepolis fortification tablets, the PF texts, comes in.
Ah, the tablet.
These genuine indigenous sources, we're talking tens of thousands of clay tablets, many written in Elamite, but also Aramaic and Babylonian. They provide an incredible, intimate, really granular database of how the daily economy and logistics actually functioned.
So what kind of details are we getting from these tablets that, say, Greek authors simply couldn't have known or maybe weren't interested in?
We get everything from the incredibly mundane to the macro level stuff. These tablets meticulously record food rations given out, not just to soldiers and priests, but specifically to men, women, and children, by name sometimes. They detail complex storage systems, specific travel routes, administrative hierarchies, the precise payment-in-kind system used across the imperial lands. They are the intimate logistical materials of Persian life, revealing a staggering degree of centralization and organization.
Can you give us a concrete example just to make that sheer scale real for us?
Certainly. Okay, take the PF 798 tablet. It meticulously details a ration of 130 liters of barley.
Okay.
Now, this specific barley was given to a Phoenician man named Barik-el, and it was payment in kind for service he had rendered in the town of Ithama. But the tablet doesn't just record the amount. It specifies the administrator who issued the payment, the precise location, and the date, November-December 501 BCE.
Incredible detail.
To maintain the level of micromanagement across an empire that size year after year, it required an immense, highly trained, multilingual bureaucracy. It's quite something.
But this bureaucratic reality, despite the noble ideals of data and Arta, it wasn't always pure or efficient, was it? It must have created an environment ripe for corruption and opportunism, which is what the Gemilu case seems to highlight, right?
Gemilu of Uruk. Yes, he is a phenomenal case study. He just rips the curtain back on the administrative reality of the Achaemenid Empire. Because this guy, Gemilu, he was a known thief, a petty criminal, who somehow climbed the ladder to become a middle management official. The chief farmer, no less, at the highly prestigious Iana Temple in Babylonia under Cyrus and Cambyses.
Okay, so he's not just managing fields, he's essentially running long-term scams while drawing a state salary and exploiting the system.
Precisely, that's exactly it. His contract stipulated that he should receive oxen and seed barley to work the temple land. Fair enough. In exchange, he was supposed to deliver a massive predetermined quota of barley and dates to the temple stores.
Standard contract, sounds like.
Pretty standard, but when the harvest came, surprise, surprise, he failed to meet his quota. But then, audaciously, he goes back to the administrator and demands more resources. He fraudulently demanded 600 more oxen and 400 peasants, claiming he needed them to make up the shortfall he himself had caused.
Wait, so the same system that Darius promoted as embodying law and order allowed a known fraudster to not only keep his job, but demand more state resources after failing his quota. How long did this go on for?
20 years.
20 years.
20 years. Gemilu clearly siphoned off profits for himself, probably through backhanders, bribes to various Persian officials who were willing to look the other way. It just proves that while Darius promoted divine order from the top, the day-to-day reality on the ground was full of imperial corruption, favoritism, people looking out for themselves. And this whole story, this saga, is chronicled across over 100 cuneiform tablets. It gives us that rare, messy, here-and-now window into the fact that corruption is definitely not a modern phenomenon, and that vast empires, no matter how principled their legal foundation might sound, always have operational flaws and, well, bad actors.
It's an amazing corrective to the simplistic Greek view, isn't it?
However,
if the king's law, the data, was truly defined by fighting Draga, the lie, then we have to assume that the enforcement of justice was swift and brutal when required.
Yeah.
It couldn't all be corruption.
Absolutely. The empire was definitely not tolerant of opposition to the crown. Darius's own inscriptions, particularly the ones detailing the suppression of widespread rebellions early in his reign, they stress the extreme severity of enforcement. So while the empire promoted harmony as an ideal, we have to acknowledge the force behind it. For followers of the lie, the Draga, the executions were horrific. Darius describes rebels offering their necks, being held in chains while he literally steps on their bellies before ordering their public, gruesome deaths. The promotion of justice was always backed by the extreme sovereign power of the great king. There was an iron fist inside the velvet glove.
The logistics of governing this massive bureaucratic landmass required more than just red tape and clay tablets, though. It required the power center itself, the great king and his entire court, to be constantly on the move. Which brings us to the unique movement patterns of the Achaemenid power structure. It wasn't static?
No, not at all. The great kings deliberately retained the nomadic lifestyle of their Eurasian ancestors. Their movement was essential. It's described not as some kind of seasonal vacation, but as a nomadic migration on a par with the relocation patterns typical of itinerant peoples.
Wow. So where did they go?
They had to follow the climate, basically. The court resided in the cool mountains of Ecbatana for the summer. Then they'd travel south to the administrative capitals of Babylon or Susa for the winter, and they often settled in Persepolis or Pasargadae for important spring festivals.
That sounds less like a seasonal move and more like the relocation of an entire city, an entire government, including the military, the treasury, the bureaucracy.
Yeah.
What was the size of this marching court?
It was immense. A moving city is a good description. And the pace, well, it was excruciatingly slow.
How slow?
The journey between Susa and Ecbatana, for instance, could easily take over 2 months. They covered no more than about 10 kilometers a day, maybe 6 miles, even when marching for 7 or 8 hours straight.
Wow.
Imagine the logistics required just to feed and water that moving population. Thousands of horses, officials, servants, the elite guard. It's mind-boggling.
And the march itself wasn't just functional, it was theater, wasn't it? Designed to project absolute power to every province they traversed. Can you describe the spectacular order of march?
Oh, it was pure, deliberate spectacle, highly ritualized. The procession began with priests walking on foot, carrying silver fire altars and chanting sacred hymns. They were immediately followed by a chariot consecrated to Ahura Mazda, drawn by these magnificent white Nicaean horses, and then the white stallion, designated as the horse of the sun.
Symbolic power right there. And the elite guard, the immortals, they must have been an incredible sight.
They were the centerpiece, really. The immortals, 10,000 strong, the absolute pride of the Persian military, they marched next. They wore stunning, brightly colored uniforms, often adorned with golden necklaces and studded with precious stones. This opulence just communicated unrivaled wealth and force.
And the king.
Finally, after the kinsmen and servants, came the king himself in his personal chariot. Although the sources even preserve this surprising little Greek vignette of the great king, maybe bored by the tedious speed of the procession, just sort of whittling a piece of wood to pass the time during the slow progress.
Humanizes him a bit. So the power center was truly the king and his movable seat of government, which was essentially the tent.
Yes, the royal tent, the Ganaka, was the ultimate visible emblem of authority. It was constructed of rich materials, furnished sumptuously with gold plate, imported textiles. The tent's significance was so great that during a battle, if the enemy managed to capture the Ganaka, it immediately symbolized the collapse and surrender of the monarchic authority itself. It was that important.
Maintaining this nomadic tradition and moving the entire state, it required an infrastructure far superior to anything in the Greek world at the time, surely.
Absolutely. We often hear about the logistics of the 2,400-kilometer royal road connecting Susa to Sardis in Anatolia. That was a journey that still required 90 days on foot.
A long time.
A very long time. But we know from the travel ration texts, those same administrative Persepolis tablets we discussed earlier, that the road system saw massive, documented crisscrossing of individuals traveling the length and breadth of the empire. These documents record journeys by messengers, administrators traveling from India all the way to Susa, and from Susa to remote locations like Kandahar in Afghanistan. The empire was connected by a fast, reliable system of roads and post stations. It had to be.
Okay, now we have to address the difficult reality of construction. The ability to build these roads and palaces like Persepolis. It wasn't solely due to administrative efficiency, was it? It was powered by a massive, coercive labor force.
That is absolutely vital context for understanding the true mechanics of this empire. Palaces like Persepolis, which Darius I began constructing around 518 BCE, they were built not just by local laborers earning payment in kind, but by thousands and thousands of slaves and war captives, known collectively as Kurtash. As the empire grew, it benefited exponentially from enslavement. We have to be clear. The Achaemenid state was fundamentally a slave-owning society that relied heavily on unfree labor for its grand projects.
And the Persian sources themselves confirm the coercive nature of this labor. We aren't just relying on, say, Greek hearsay here about Persian brutality.
No, the evidence is internal and it's undeniable. The Kurtash were forcibly uprooted from their homelands and deported, often grouped together at Persepolis by ethnicity. The tablets actually attest to labor gangs that were separated by their origin.
Like specific groups?
Yes, specifically enumerated gangs of 300 Lycians, 150 Thracians, 547 Egyptians, 980 Cappadocians. The number are right there.
Wow.
And crucially, the Persepolis fortification tablets reveal that the food rations these workers received were distributed at a strict subsistence level. Just enough for survival, basically. It wasn't a wage. They were not in Persia of their own free will to earn a living. They were forced laborers ensuring the engine of expansion kept turning. That's the less glamorous reality.
The Greek tendency toward caricature, that construction of the other, it impacted no one more severely than the great kings themselves did it. Let's look at the Achaemenid founders, maybe starting with Cyrus the Great. He seems to have had a much more sophisticated public reputation, at least compared to his successors.
Oh, Cyrus was an extraordinary figure, no doubt about it. A pragmatic political architect, an ingenious military strategist. He was the heir to Anshan and the Pasargadae tribe, and his initiation into kingship was highly symbolic, retaining these ancient nomadic Eurasian rites.
What did that involve?
Well, he had to wear the dynastic cowhide coat, the ganaka we mentioned, and consume the humble subsistence foodstuffs of the Eurasian nomads. Things like simple dates and a dish of arag, which is this thick, sour, fermented mare's milk. Humility and connection to his simple tribal roots were sort of hallmarks of his sacred initiation ritual. It grounded him.
But this humility, it seems to have contrasted pretty sharply with the ruthlessness of his empire building, particularly during the Babylonian conquest.
It did. The conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE was really a dual effort. Military power, absolutely, but also pure spin, public relations.
Okay.
While the battle at Opis was brutal, Babylonian troops were cut to pieces, the invaders slaughtered inhabitants inside the city walls. Cyrus launched a massive PR campaign immediately afterward to justify the takeover.
And that is where the famous Cyrus cylinder comes into play, isn't it?
It is arguably antiquity's most important, and you could say most egregious, PR exercise. In this text, Cyrus completely refashions himself. He's presented as Marduk's chosen champion who restored order and peace, contrasting himself with the previous, supposedly wicked king of Babylon.
How does it describe the invasion?
The cylinder claims he entered Babylon unhindered and unopposed, and that the people joyfully accepted his benevolent rule. It specifically states that he relieved their weariness and freed them from their service. It's pretty blatant propaganda designed to rewrite a bloody conquest as a peaceful liberation.
But the propaganda worked spectacularly in certain circles, didn't it? Particularly among the Jewish population who had been forcibly exiled to Babylon.
It absolutely did. It secured him one of the most remarkable titles ever given to a non-Jew. Cyrus is the only Gentile in the entire Bible to receive the title Meshiach, or Messiah, the Anointed One.
Well, why?
He earned this because he not only freed the Jews from Babylonian captivity, but he decreed and financially supported the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple. So even if the prophet Isaiah recognized Cyrus didn't follow Yahweh, the king was still viewed as a God-sent savior for his, well, seemingly virtuous and tolerant actions towards them.
The difference in reputation between Cyrus and his son, Cambyses II, is just vast, though. Cambyses seems to have inherited one of the worst historical reputations almost entirely due to the Greeks, it sounds like.
Oh, Cambyses II is portrayed as a madman and a bogus Herodotean caricature in the Greek accounts. The most famous smear is Herodotus's outrageous claim that Cambyses attacked, stabbed, and killed the sacred Egyptian Apis bull, the living manifestation of the god Ptah, supposedly causing religious panic and confirming his madness.
Right, the classic Greek trope. Foreign rulers are irrational, prone to fits of fury.
Exactly. But when we privilege the Persian version, as we find it in Egyptian sources, the story flips completely.
What do the Egyptian sources say?
They paint a picture of deliberate cultural respect. There's a surviving limestone relief at Saqqara, the burial place of the Apis bulls, that shows Cambyses actively adopting the prerogatives of the ancient Egyptian kings. He participated in the burial of one Apis bull and the subsequent installation of the next divine bull in 524 BCE. He honored the ancient rites, paid for the elaborate funeral. He was viewed by many Egyptian priests not as some conquering madman, but as their legitimate king, continuing the ancient pharaonic tradition.
So the Greek story was just made up or twisted.
It seems designed purely for character assassination, a complete inversion of the respectful realities shown in Egyptian evidence.
Okay, finally, let's turn to Xerxes I, the great king who led the invasion of Greece, and who receives perhaps the most vicious caricature of all. He's painted as this carnivalesque creature.
Yeah, Xerxes' Greek legacy is that of someone unhinged, unfocused, and unworthy of the Persian throne, let alone victory over the Hellenes. The most bizarre anecdote, later immortalized in Handel's opera Circe, is that Xerxes fell deeply in love with a plane tree while marching through Asia Minor.
In love with the tree.
Supposedly adorned it with jewelry, put a guard over it. This story was clearly intended to show he was hopelessly frivolous, totally lacked the rationality required of a true ruler in the Greek view.
But, again, like with Cambyses, the Persian evidence offers a very different interpretation of that action, doesn't it?
Indeed it does. There's a cylinder seal image, and it actually shows Xerxes, his name is inscribed so we know it's him, engaged in a sacred act of worship. He's shown adorning a tree with jewelry and offerings. This connects him directly to the ancient Near Eastern tree cult, where trees were seen as holy conduits, places where humans encounter the divine. It was a deeply religious act.
So the Greeks just didn't get it.
The Greeks, likely incapable of understanding or maybe unwilling to portray this deep, traditional religious reverence for trees and nature, just twisted the pious act into a tale of ridiculous folly. It suited their narrative of superior rationality perfectly. It's a neat visual antidote, that seal, to the poisonous Herodotian spin.
Okay, let's bring the focus back now to the military engagement that defined the entire narrative, Thermopylae. It's critical to remember, as you said, Xerxes' ambition was vast. This wasn't just simple retaliation for the Ionian Revolt decades earlier.
Absolutely not. Xerxes was pursuing imperium sine an empire without end. He fully intended to incorporate mainland Greece into the Persian realm. He knew the Greeks had mobilized a formidable fleet, about 400 triremes, which presented a significant naval threat. Therefore, his strategy had to be complex. It required a carefully orchestrated, combined land and sea operation. He knew the pass of Thermopylae, the hot gates, was a natural defensive bottleneck. He knew the Greeks would likely make a stand there, and critically, that terrain would neutralize their superior naval forces for that part of the campaign. It funneled them.
And this narrow terrain immediately negated the Persian army's greatest tactical advantages, right? Which were its massive numbers and its excellent cavalry.
Precisely. The pass prevented the use of cavalry entirely, and the Persian army's other great strength lay in its archers. They could unleash these arrow barrages that supposedly blacken the sky, but even these were less effective against a deep, heavily armored formation in such a constricted space.
Right.
The Greeks, meanwhile, had a massive tactical advantage in their specific equipment and formation for that kind of fight.
Let's dig into the technical differences for a second. The Greek hoplite soldier seems fundamentally designed to counter the typical Persian soldier in a close-quarters engagement like that.
Yeah. The hoplite was essentially a walking fortress in comparison. They had superior, much heavier armor, typically bronze plate covering their chest, legs, helmet, sometimes weighing up to 70 pounds in total.
Wow.
They fought in the phalanx formation, where the massive convex shield, the aspis, locked with the shields of the men on either side, creating this nearly impenetrable bronze wall. Their primary weapon was the long spear, the dory, which is generally 8 to 15 feet long. This allowed the phalanx to project force and strike the more lightly armored Persians without immediate fear of reprisal. They had reach and protection.
And the typical Persian soldier, in contrast.
They were generally geared more towards speed and mobility on open ground. They often wore quilted linen or leather armor far lighter than bronze and carried wicker shields. These were excellent against missile fire out in the open, but pretty much useless against the crushing momentum of a charging phalanx in close quarters.
Yeah.
Their armaments were shorter, too often short spears, swords like the echenikes. It meant they could usually only engage the Greeks after the front rank of the phalanx had already struck them with those long spears. They really relied on overwhelming numbers, flanking maneuvers with cavalry, and missile fire, none of which worked well at Thermopylae initially.
Okay, so given that tactical discrepancy in the pass, how did Xerxes manage to break the Greeks even on the first few days? It wasn't an immediate rout.
No, he used his greatest asset, sheer volume, and frankly, the expendability of his non-elite troops. The source accounts, even the Greek ones, confirm Xerxes successfully employed frontal attacks, just wave after wave of his allied contingents, Medes, Cetians, others. He effectively wore down the Greeks. Pure attrition warfare. The Spartans and the Thespians, despite their superior armor and skill, were forced to fight almost nonstop for 2 days. And given Persia's vast resources and manpower, it was a perfectly rational, if costly, strategy for Xerxes. Throw bodies at the problem until it breaks.
So when we look at the battle's core outcome, the heroic stand of the 300 Spartans, while dramatic, is almost secondary to the simple fact that the Persians successfully executed their military plan eventually.
The military conclusion, if you look at it coldly, is unavoidable. The Battle of Thermopylae can only be interpreted as a great Persian victory. The frontal attacks achieved their strategic goal. They exhausted and preoccupied the main Greek force defending the pass.
And then came the flanking maneuver.
Exactly. Once the local scouts revealed the mountain pathway, the Anopeta Path Xerxes didn't hesitate. He immediately dispatched his elite immortals to outflank the Greek position. And once they got behind the Greeks, the defense was simply untenable.
So Leonidas' decision to stay and die, the absolute foundation of the heroic myth, needs to be analyzed through a practical, strategic lens too, doesn't it?
I think it has to be. Herodotus, of course, framed it as a heroic desire for immortal glory, for Kleos, and maybe that was part of it. But the main reason Leonidas ordered the bulk of the remaining Greek forces to withdraw and stayed behind with his rear guard, the Spartans, the Thespians, and maybe some Helots, was almost certainly tactical necessity.
Why necessity?
Think about it. If all the Greeks retreated through the narrow pass at once, the massive force of Persian archers and, more importantly, the powerful Persian cavalry waiting on the other side would have been deployed on the open road. They would have overtaken and systematically butchered the fleeing Greek army. It would have been a massacre.
Ah, right.
So a desperate rearguard action was absolutely needed to buy those essential hours for the main forces to escape south and regroup. It was a sacrifice, yes, but a strategically necessary one.
And the end, once they were outflanked, was swift and brutal for that rearguard.
It was. The Immortals successfully ambushed the Phocians guarding the mountain path and descended behind the main Greek position. Leonidas died in the final assault. The remaining force, completely surrounded and cut off, retreated to a nearby hillock. They apparently maintained their formation until they were finally killed by relentless arrow barrages from the Persians firing from all sides. Game over.
What about the Thebans? Weren't they there too?
Yes, and notably, a large contingent of Thebans, who had been somewhat reluctant participants anyway, surrendered relatively early to Xerxes once the situation was hopeless. They chose survival over a doomed last stand.
So the pass was taken.
The pass was taken, the simultaneous naval blockade by the Greek fleet at Artemisium failed to stop the Persian navy, and the road to central Greece towards Athens was wide open for Xerxes. Mission accomplished from his perspective.
And our sources, even Herodotus, confirm the dark reality of the fall of this successful conquest. This wasn't just a clean military operation, it was a brutal invasion.
It absolutely was. After the pass was secured, the Persians moved immediately into the region of focus. And Herodotus, in a rare, grim admission of the kind of dark reality of conquest that Greek authors usually prefer to gloss over, recorded the atrocities that occurred. Captured Phocian women were reportedly gang-raped to death by the invading Persian forces.
Horrific.
It confirms that Xerxes' successful march south is marked by the harsh realities and brutal excesses common to pretty much all ancient military conquests. It wasn't unique to the Persians, but it happened. So the Achaemenid Empire was ultimately destroyed by Alexander the Great in 330 BCE. But the memory, and especially the mythology surrounding its great kings, remained incredibly potent. It shaped successor empires in Iran itself for the next 2 millennia.
So later Iranian dynasties consciously look back and utilize the memory of the Achaemenids to legitimize their own rule.
Absolutely. The Sasanian Empire, which rose centuries after the Achaemenids fell, heavily used this memory. You also see it preserved in the great Iranian epic poem, the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, composed around 1000 CE.
How are they portrayed there?
Well, Achaemenid kings like Cyrus transcend mere history and become these grand mythical figures. Cyrus, for instance, transforms into Kai Khosrow, a legendary king who was supposedly so pure that he was oculated to heaven rather than suffering a mundane death.
Wow.
And the ruins of Persepolis itself were preserved in Iranian memory, not as Persepolis, but as Takhti Jamshid, the throne of Jamshid, tying the Achaemenid dynasty into this timeless, glorious national past.
And this national identity, this historical memory, was dramatically leveraged much more recently in the 20th century, particularly by the last Shah of Iran.
Oh, hugely. The 1971 celebration of the 2500th anniversary of the Persian Empire by Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was a monumental propaganda effort. Extravagant doesn't even begin to cover it.
What was the goal?
It was explicitly designed to create a direct lineage, identifying the Shah himself with Cyrus the Great. It was about celebrating Iranianness and the nation's glorious pre-Islamic heritage, specifically positioned before what was framed as the shameful Arab conquest. The centerpiece was this absolutely massive parade at Persepolis, featuring 6,000 soldiers dressed in the historical uniforms of every Persian dynasty, cementing this manufactured glorious lineage through spectacle.
And this political appropriation is what directly led to the widespread modern human rights myth surrounding Cyrus the Great, isn't it?
Precisely. That's the direct origin. The modern Cyrus craze, you see his image on posters, T-shirts online, portrays him today as a kind of proto-human rights activist. And this pseudo-history, it's fueled by national pride, yes, but it stems directly from the Shah's highly selective reading of the Cyrus Cylinder back in '71. He promoted it as the world's first Bill of Human Rights.
How does that specific claim hold up when we actually read the cylinder's content? Without the modern political spin, what does it actually say?
Well, the claim is based almost entirely on that single short line we mentioned earlier, where Cyrus claims, "I relieved their weariness and freed them from their service in Babylon." Now, while this does reflect his known tolerance for local gods and traditions and maybe reducing forced labor burdens, it is fundamentally a statement about restoring order and gaining local support. It's not proclaiming universal human rights in the modern sense.
Right.
And the myth is constantly reinforced by, and I'm quoting our sources here, a plethora of fake translations which have been appearing on the internet for decades, often used to bolster modern Iranian national pride or political arguments.
Right.
We saw the lasting influence of this when Shirin Ebadi, accepting the Nobel Peace Prize in 2003, actually quoted what she believed were Cyrus's genuine words on human rights from the cylinder. The power of the myth, even based on mistranslation, endures.
Okay, so after stripping away both the ancient Greek bias and the modern national propaganda, what is the final sort of objective assessment of the Achaemenid model of empire? What allowed it to last so long and function so effectively?
I think its enduring strength really lay in its remarkably elastic approach to governing. The Persians were not aggressive cultural imperialists in the way the Romans or later European powers often were. They operated on a highly pragmatic, basically wealth extraction model. They were, as one source puts it, content to receive the tribute. And critically, they allowed conquered peoples, whether they were Ionians in Anatolia or the Jews in Jerusalem or the Egyptians along the Nile, to continue their traditional practices, maintain their local laws, and worship their local gods.
They weren't focused on forced conformity or systematic cultural replacement then?
Exactly. They imposed no forceful adoption of the Persian language across the board, or the Persian religion, or a uniform governmental system in the way that later empires would. This model of what we might cautiously call enlightened empire, where local traditions were often maintained for the sake of stability and ease of rule, it stands in pretty stark contrast to the aggressive Romanization efforts later on, or the often explicitly white supremacist ideology that underpins some later European imperial powers. The Achaemenids proved, arguably, that you could rule a vast multi-ethnic, multi-religious global empire without necessarily destroying the fundamental identity of the conquered peoples. You just needed their loyalty and their taxes. #outro.
Wow. Okay, this deep dive has really taken us on quite a journey, hasn't it? Fundamentally altering, I think, our standard understanding of the Greco-Persian Wars. We moved from that ingrained, biased Greek myth of heroic freedom versus Eastern tyranny at Thermopylae to the complex, sophisticated, highly bureaucratic, yet also pragmatic, and yes, slave-owning reality of the Achaemenid superpower.
And what we learn from these indigenous sources, the Persian version, is that the Achaemenid Empire endured for over 2 centuries. It suffered no substantial territorial loss for most of that time, not because of weakness or some kind of inherent barbarian inferiority, but precisely because of its administrative sophistication and its flexible approach to power. It was only brought down, ultimately, by total relentless war under Alexander the Great, who pursued Darius III to the bitter end. It wasn't internal failure that did it in.
So the ultimate takeaway here for you listening is pretty profound, I think. We spent literally 2 millennia believing the victorious Greek narrative, a narrative which successfully defined not only the historical East and Western minds, but also in many ways the intellectual and cultural identity of the West itself.
Right.
So if the ancient Persian model of governance flexible, tolerant of local culture, focused on stability and tribute extraction rather than cultural annihilation, if that is truly a compelling alternative model of enlightened empire, then we have to ask ourselves, don't we? What other parts of our own history taught through that dominant Western lens, are we still fundamentally misunderstanding or missing completely?
That really is the essential question to ponder, isn't it? How many other fields, not just ancient history, but maybe philosophy, science, global politics today, are we studying where the non-Western or the indigenous narrative remains largely unheard or relegated to footnotes? It's a challenge, really, to seek out the missing half of every story.
A huge thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive. We look forward to exploring the next set of sources with you next time.